Hello everybody, welcome to another watercolor tutorial. We are going to be attempting to paint a much better version of this. This was my first attempt and it looks horrific. I'm embarrassed to even show you that. But I'm very excited. We're finally starting Christmas tutorials. Today marks the first one. And we're gonna start off with trying to paint a lovely Christmas tree. So we are going to be using a lot of greens today. And the first thing you can do is grab a very light green, or if you don't have a light green, you can use any green and just water it down quite a bit, because our first layer is just going to be getting down these tiny details. So I'm going to flip my paper over and just quickly show you with a pencil what we're going to be doing with a paintbrush. We're going to be painting these little sections in our first layer. So we'll have the top that kind of goes like this. Then our next section, we're going to leave this space blank and paint it from here. So we're going to have another section that sort of comes out here, and there's a few branches like so. Again, we're going to leave another gap and paint some more branches, and we're just going to do that all the way down, and then it'll change up a little bit down here, and we're not going to be doing these arches anymore, but I'll show you what I mean when we get there. So pick up very watered down pigment on your paintbrush, and we're going to start with the top. I'll zoom in so you can see exactly what I'm doing here. And I'm going to have a very long top here. That's even too dark for me, so I've watered my brush even more. I'm gonna have some branches coming like this, and we want the ends to be rounded. You might have a brush that does that for you, which is fantastic. I envy you, but I do not possess such a brush, so I have to kind of round my own ends. I want mine to be a little bit more lime green than it is, so I just added that in, watered it down again. And again, we move on. I'm just going to paint a tiny little thing down here, but I'm still leaving a little white gap. And then my next section, you can think of it like we're painting an arch almost. Rounding my edges, and then adding branches to that, or pieces of our branch, I guess you could say. Like so. You can have some coming off the bottom if you wish as well. All right, our next section is going to look similar. I'm going to go down a little bit more for this one. And you want to make sure that each section that you paint is a tiny bit wider than the previous one, if we're following the traditional shape of a Christmas tree. One mistake that I made in my previous one is I don't think I made these branches thick enough, like all these individual buds coming off of it. They weren't thick enough, and so in subsequent layers I basically painted over them, which was not ideal. It looked horrible, as you saw. I was considering releasing that one because I did film that entire thing, and I was like, no, I cannot. Like, I have some sort of standard on my channel now, and I cannot release that. So I swallowed my, not my pride, that's not what I'm trying to say, but it was just hard because I spent a very long time on that tree and on that tutorial, and then, you know, feeling like I have to redo it. It's a bit frustrating. This is much too dark. I'm picking up some pigment here. you really want it to be nice and light because you're going to be painting more layers that are darker. So as if I didn't already have enough water, I'm adding more. So just one more bud here. So I'm gonna have another section here. I love Christmas season. I love just releasing Christmas tutorials and Christmas cards. They're so fun and easy to paint. And for some reason, you guys just view my videos during Christmas more than any other time of the year, which is great, but I want to know why. So if you're one of those people that just clicked, like you ended up on my video and you're not a regular watcher, I would love to hear why. Did the YouTube algorithm send you here? Were you recommended a video? Are you looking for Christmas crafts to do? Please comment below. I'm just, again, lifting off pigment because it's too dark for my first layer. I don't want it to be this dark. In fact, see, I'm even lifting it off the top one here because this was also too dark. So all I'm doing is dragging my brush across the paint and then dabbing it on a paper towel to remove that excess pigment. Okay, so we're about halfway down the tree, a little more than I would like actually. So now we're gonna start separating these sections and they're gonna be more drooping, if you will, more kind of like U-shaped almost. So I'm gonna have one kind of coming like this, and it's gonna have some droopies coming from it, like that. Gonna have enough, and they don't all have to be uniform. Like you don't even have to make them all uniform like I was doing. You could have just made them sort of uneven. And that's the thing, is you kind of have to follow your intuition, because before I was looking at this picture trying to make it identical, and that's why my tree ended up looking just horrendous. So follow your intuition. Follow what feels like it's going to look nice and go from there. Again, too dark, but I can't really do anything at this point. So as I'm moving down my tree, I'm making my swoops or my branches lower and lower, like facing towards the ground. I'm just varying it up constantly. I don't know if you can hear my wood stove in the background, but it is crackling like crazy. Okay, I'm gonna zoom it out a bit so you can see the whole thing. I'm telling you, that's already looking so much better than the other one, the one that I painted first. It was just awful. But okay, so we're gonna let this completely dry. That was another mistake that I sort of made before. I didn't let it completely dry, and then we'll come back to the next step. So that is completely dry, which is very good. And now what I'm doing is taking a much darker green for this next part. And we're going to be almost filling in the sections in between each branch section. So I'm gonna start here, and you just wanna be mindful of making sure you're not going over the first section that you painted. So try to go around it. And that was the mistake that I made in the first one. Because I painted the first layer too thin, when I went over it with the second layer, I painted over all of the beautiful rounded buds, and it just completely ruined the effect. And you can have some of that coming out in little buds as well, overlapping the portion above. That's totally fine. Just make sure that you don't leave any white space, otherwise it'll look a bit silly. The contrast between this layer and the previous one is still a little bit too much for me. Like you want them to become gradually more intense, not, you know, go from white to black almost. So I did water down this second section a bit. And you do have to be patient here to make sure that you're not going over all the beautiful details that you painted. Already looking so much better. I'm telling you guys, that is looking so much better than that first tree I painted. Oh my gosh. That was just something else, I'm telling you. If it helps, you can outline these little wisps or these buds first, especially as you get lower and lower down your tree, because everything starts being a little bit more spread out. So it might be easier to outline them first. So yeah, as you move lower and lower, you'll have bigger sections that are open. And that's when you're totally welcome to basically do the same thing that you did in your first layer and start adding almost, you know, their own branches. Or branches that mirror the ones in the first layer. It gets important when you get to the bottom to really spread out those buds, because this is where your tree takes shape. This is where it's supposed to taper off. I also can't stress the importance of really letting your layers dry before the next one. Like in a lot of paintings, you can get away with it And I always try to get away with it because, gosh, waiting for paint to dry is something else. But in this painting, it's more imperative than ever to let the paint dry. And you can use a hair dryer for sure to speed up the process. That's what I tend to do. But if you don't let it dry in between the layers, it'll just, it won't look great. It'll blend into the other layers. You'll have these ill-defined blobby shapes, and you don't want that. So we've got our second layer down, which is great. So we're gonna let this completely dry before we move on to the next step. Okay, with the next layer, we are going to be doing something quite similar, really. So we're just going in and then painting in some more of these buds in random sections, but we're painting on top of the second layer that we painted. So you want to leave the first layer untouched. And obviously we're not going over all of the same sections because we do want some of the second layer to show through, of course. See, one mistake that I made is I thought of these layers as like the individual shapes that I originally painted in the first layer, for example. And that's the problem. You can't think of it that way. You have to think of it as if you're painting more branches on a tree. And when you start thinking of it that way, it becomes a lot more intuitive to paint, rather than painting these blobs or these sections in relation to another blob. You begin to paint branches. Okay, so that was our third layer. And now we're gonna move on to our fourth layer. The thing I don't like is that see how these first layers here are much thinner than this big, some anemone looking thing over here? I don't like that. And so I'm going to just paint over some of them just to try and make them look a little bit slimmer. You can even just kind of paint lightly on each side and give it some sort of highlights or lowlights, whatever, just to make it a little bit smaller because it was looking too big for my liking there. Now, I'm going to be adding black to my green now. Well, I was before, but a lot more because I want it to be quite a bit darker. And this is where we're really gonna start adding the dark features. Again, use your intuition. Think of it as adding branches to a tree rather than these individual blobs that we've painted. I apologize if I'm not giving enough verbal instructions or, as many as I usually do. It's just kind of hard to explain such a repetitive thing, and it really is an intuitive process, so you just have to practice to get the hang of your individual style of painting it and all the little nuances and so on. We are also going to be adding some details to our first layer because it's very, very light compared to all of the subsequent layers, and we don't quite want it that light. So now what I'm doing is I'm watering down just a little bit of green a lot, like a lot, and dabbing the excess water off on my paper towel. And I'm just going to lightly add these darkened areas to the first layer that we painted. And because it's so light, you don't have to be very methodical about it. You can just kind of whip it on. Just run your paintbrush across it, each sort of section. And all we're doing here is trying to limit the major contrast that we have between that first layer and the rest of the layers. I'm even grabbing some darker pigment and adding it. I think I might go in with one more layer, and I'm just switching to my quadruple zero brush here with a lot of pigment, like a lot of very dark pigment. And I'm gonna add some very fine details to the branches, the buds, to give it one little final piece of detail here. And I'm just lightly defining some of the branches with a very dark pigment. And by adding these very gentle dark features, you're distinguishing and separating some of the branches from the others so that you prevent it from looking too much like a big blob. I personally really like how that looks, but some people might not like it. It might be too much, and that's okay. You don't have to add this part. But I always like to tinker with details and see, you know, what adding certain things might add to the painting. Sometimes it ends horribly and it doesn't look very good, but a lot of the time it's definitely a learning experience where you end up painting something really neat. And the great thing about watercolor is if you don't like something, you can a lot of the time fix it just by blending it out. As I usually do, I'm adding another layer with almost completely black watercolor. I added a tiny bit of green just to give it a bit of a tint, but I am mostly using black here. And I'm just adding it to the undersides of some of my branches towards the center, just to give some more contrast. You don't have to do this, of course, but this is what I'm choosing to do. Okay, I think we're finally finished. I could keep going on and on and on and on with these layers, but I think we're all done. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I would really appreciate your feedback, so let me know what you thought about this tutorial and this Christmas tree in the comments down below. Other than that, thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit like on this video, and I will see you in the next one.